Hello friends, in this video we'll learn how to use Sprint Batch. I've prepared for you some examples how to read a file with data using Sprint Batch and save data to the database after transformation. I also prepared example how to read data from REST endpoint and also transform it and save to the database. And I've prepared an example how to schedule Sprint Batch execution. First of all, let's generate empty Spring Boot project with required dependencies for Sprint Batch and database. I select dependency for Sprint Batch. I select dependency for GPA. We will use H2 database in our tutorial, but you can use any database you want. And we use Lombok to avoid boilerplate code, and we also add web dependency to be able to create REST endpoint. Okay, let's call our project, for example, a Sprint Batch example. Okay, and we will use a Java 17, Gradle, and Sprint 3.1.3. Let's click generate and let's open our project using IntelliJ IDEA. Okay, I've opened my project in IntelliJ, and let's say we want to read and store some books in our database. I have prepared data. Let me create file in the resources. I create CSV file. And my CSV file will contain only 3 fields, just for the sake of simplicity. It will contain title, author, and year of publishing. And we're gonna read this file and store data in the database after some transformation. Okay, and for these purposes, let's create step by step using entity, GPA. In this tutorial, we avoid service layer just to save some time. But of course, if you write this tutorial on your own, and if, for example, you use this tutorial for real project application, please use service layer and DTO classes to make layers dependent with each other. Okay, let's create entity. And inside the entity, let's create book entity. We add entity, table, and let's add data annotation from Lombok. We add ID and just a long field. Okay, we created our entity. Let's create a repository layer. Okay, we are good to go, and let's create our batch jobs. First of all, let's create package. We call it config, and we create batch config file. Sorry. Let me refactor and rename it to the batch config. We mark this class as configuration, so Spring will be able to add this as configuration class to the context. Okay, and we're gonna create job to read file, and we're gonna put steps to this job, and inside steps we're gonna add reader, we're gonna add writer, and we're gonna add processor. Okay, we create a bin. We call job. We use job from Spring Batch. And let's call our job, for example, book reader job. And we're gonna use job repository and platform. Platform transaction manager. We need these dependencies for our steps. And what we're gonna return new job builder. And we're gonna build our job. We're gonna add incrementer as run ID incrementer. Okay, we're gonna add start. We're gonna add start, and we will pass our step to this start, and afterwards we're gonna call build. Okay, let's put some name to our job builder, and we call it book read job. And we're gonna pass job repository. And to pass data to the start, we need to create a step. And let's create a step. First of all, first example I will show you with chunks step. So let's create chunks step. We call bin, and we create step object. I will call chunks step. Okay, and we also gonna pass job repository because our chunks stack we require it, and platform manager. Okay, and let's create our step. We're gonna use step builder. We're gonna put book reader step as a name, and as far as I remember, job repository. Also, we're gonna put to this step builder, and we're gonna say that we want to read a book entity, and we want to return book entity. So we're gonna add book entity, and it's chunk. Okay, and in chunks, chunk we can specify chunk size. It's the size, how many chunks will be in one step. Let's say we want to set 10 chunks. Okay, and we need to pass also transaction manager to this chunk, and we specify reader, we specify a processor, and we specify writer. So the flow is next. Our job executes our chunk step, and our chunk step executes chunks. First it runs reader reads some data, then a processor receives this data from the reader, and then writer will receive data from the processor and will perform some write operations. And that's how Spring Batch will work. Let me call build. Okay, and we need to pass this reader, processor, and writer to these methods, and that's how we will configure our batch job. First of all, a reader. We're gonna read from the CSV file, so we can specify reader. We also can specify reader as custom class. I will show you next, but we can specify reader using a flat file item reader from Spring Batch. Let me specify a bin. I also add step scope, since it's the bin in the scope of the step. I create a bin, a flat file item reader, and I say that my bin will read book entity, will return book entity to this processor, and let me call it reader. Okay, what I'm gonna return? I'm gonna return new flat file item reader. New flat file item reader I can create using builder. I can also create using flat file item reader constructor, but builder is more preferable for me. Let me add return new and copy paste this builder. Okay, and let me call build. We need to specify some parameters to our builder so we can set up it, and Spring batch will take this configuration parameters from flat file item reader builder and will execute the read process. Okay, first of all, let's specify our entity. We say this is book entity. Okay, and let's specify name for our reader. Let's specify name as book reader, and we need to pass resource. It's the resource which we're gonna consume. I specify new class pass resource and the name of my file book data CSV. If you have, for example, file not in the resource folder, but for example in the root of your application, you can specify instead of class path resource, you can specify something like flat file file resource, something file system resource, this one. Of course, you can specify, you can put this data file in any location you want. I just put it in the resources, and I can specify new class path resource. Okay, I specified resource, and this flat file item reader will find my file there. And I set delimiter, and I set names. I need to configure how my flat file item reader builder will read my data from this CSV file. Okay, if for example your CSV file has, for example, titles like title, something like that, you want to skip, for example, first line. Okay, so you can specify even this. You can add skip. As far as I remember, skip line. Let me check it. Line. Yeah, lines to skip, and you can specify, for example, first line to skip. But of course, if you don't have this, you don't need to skip lines. Okay. And let me get back to my batch config. So I specify names, and in names I specify new string. And I just put names as I want them to read, as title, author, and year of publishing. And after this, publishing. After this, I specify field set mapper. And I'm gonna use a new bin wrapper field set mapper, and this bin wrapper files field set mapper, I just specify it some data, some configurations. Let me set target type as book entity class. So I want my reader read this book CSV file, okay, book data CSV with delimiters comma separated. Okay, I need this it to parse name by title, author, and year of publishing, and I want to set target type to book entity. And that's when I created my reader, I can pass it to the reader. Okay, and I can specify processor and writer. Let me, you know what, let me create a package and call it batch. And let me create a class and call it book processor. Okay, actually we want to specify many processors, not only one. So let me specify some processors just to show you how to specify multiple processors. Let me specify book title processor, for example. To make our classes processor, we need to implement item processor from this print batch. And we need to set up input and output. Since I'm gonna consume booking entity and output booking entity also, I specify booking entity and booking entity. But of course, if your processor will consume some and return some different objects, you need to specify them accordingly. Okay, and we need to implement only one method, process. For now, let me add some logs. For example, something like with processing and item. Let me add more logs like title 4. And you know what? Let me return item. And let's say we want to receive title, for example, and move it to the uppercase. Okay, just make it uppercase. We need to make like this item, get title, set title, item get title to uppercase. Something like that, just to show you how this processor works. Of course, you can process your objects in any way you want. And we will return processed item. And we can add more processor like this. We can create, for example, book, I don't know, author processor. Of course, we can process author and title in one processor, but it's just for the example I want to show you that we can combine two processors or even more. And let me add self-g. And let's say this time process author. And let's say we want to add some string to each author. For example, by. Something like that. Okay, and when we set processor, we can add this process. We need to create it first. So let me create it. Firstly, let's create a bin, and with item processor type. Okay, and we specify book entity. We can also put step scope for this bin, because this is also bin inside this step. Let's call it processor. And we can create a delegator for this processor. For example, composite. Since we want to combine two processors, we can use composite item processor. Okay, and we can return this processor. And we can say processor set delegates, and we can pass our processors as in this list. So we're gonna pass a book title processor, for example, and new book author processor. And then we need to pass this processor to the processor. And finally, writer. Let's create new class and call it book writer. And we need to implement item writer. Okay, and as in the processor, we need to implement only one method. It's write. And we can use our repository to store our book in the database. Let me add log message. And let's, instead of showing all books, let me get size of the books. And what I wanna do, I can use book repository, save all, and chunk get items. So we have chunk as 10 in this batch config. This chunk will read 10 books, will process them, and when we have enough books in the chunk, 10, it will flush 10 in one writer execution. Okay, and we need to pass this book writer to this writer, and we need to create another bin. Let's create, you know what, let me copy paste this and create item writer, as you can guess, book entity, and we're gonna return our new book writer. Okay, and let me pass this writer. Okay, seems fine. You know what, to be able to see that we write our books, we can first of all we can add some annotation, some configurations to our application properties to see SQL statements. We will add sprint data GPA show SQL true, and to make the print in SQL beautifully, we need to add sprint GPA properties hibernate format SQL as true. And to create our table, we need to add sprint GPA hibernate DDL auto create. And after we start our application, it will create our table. Okay, let's run our application and see how it works. Let's click run. And in logs, let's see how our job works. As you can see, we have in logs that job, simple job, book read job launched with following parameters. And here we see step reader. It reads books, and then it processes title, author, and so, and after that it's writing. We have 9 books, so it's writing 9, and you can see these statements are executing in the database. Of course, we can add some resting point to get our books from database and see actual work. Okay, let's rerun our application and let's try to check our books from the database. Let's open our browser and navigate to localhost 8080 and book. And as you can see, we have our books. As you can see, they are processed. The title is in the uppercase, and every author has by string before the author name. And that's how our sprint batch worked. And next one, I will show you how to use REST, how to consume REST endpoint in your batch application. Let me stop my application. First of all, let's assume that we want to consume this one, but we need some data in the database. So let me create some import SQL file to add some data in our database on the application startup. In the Spring Boot, if you call your file import SQL and put it to resources, it will execute scripts in these resources automatically. So I already prepared some books data, only 3. Okay, so it will insert these books to the database on application startup. And let's say we want to we don't want to change this processor and writer. We want only to change this reader. Let me navigate to the chunk, and let me comment this reader and add another reader. And for these purposes, I need to create it first. And we need to create our custom class. Let's call it REST book reader. And of course, to make this class as reader, we need to implement item reader. And we're gonna return book entity. Okay, let me add a self-g, and we need to have some URL to call. Okay, we need a REST template. Of course, if you use another way to call some API, you can use your own functionality, but I will use REST template. And we need some flag. We need some counter to be able to see the next item in the position. So I create counter next book. And I create a list of books. Since my API returns a list of books. And let me create book entity. Okay, and we need constructor to initialize, to init our URL and REST template. Let me create constructor. Okay, and we need to implement our method read. And inside the read method, we're gonna read this endpoint, book endpoint, and we're gonna return it. And this reader will work until, will be called until data is returned. If, for example, this reader returns null, it will stop execution. And if this reader returns some book entity, not null, it will continually execute this read method. So we want to say that if this book entity list, okay, is null, what we want to do, we want to call our REST endpoint. Okay, let me create separate method and call it let's book entity. Let's call it fetch books, and let me call fetch books. So if entity list is empty, is null, we fetch books. Otherwise, we return our book. And how we get this book? Let's initialize it as null first. We say if next book is less than book entity list, size. For example, if if this index is less than size of the books, we gonna return our book. So get next book and increment our counter. Otherwise, if we already returned all books from this list, we're gonna set counter as 0 and make book entity list as null. This is one of the approaches to call API, but anyway, you can use a lot of approaches, especially if your API has some pagination. You can use this counter, this index, to call these paginated results, and of course it depends on your application requirements. Okay, let's call our API. It's on simple call since we don't have some security or configurations, etc. So we're gonna return book entity and response equals REST template get for entity and this URL, and we're gonna cast it to the book entity array. And we're gonna get response, get body, and if our books is not null, okay, we're gonna return a list. Otherwise, we return just null. Okay, and I guess that's it. May produce null pointer, and that's okay, because this method will also stop execution if exception will be triggered. If null, return, and if exception will be triggered. And in the batch config, what we can do, we can pass this reader. We can create another bin with reader, and we can pass this reader. Let's create another bin, add step scope, and let's create item reader. And we return our REST book reader. And we're gonna pass URL http localhost 8080 and book, and we're gonna pass new REST template, and we need to pass this REST entity reader to this one. Okay, and I think we are good to go, and let's try to run our application. And to make sure we call our controller, let's add SL4G and check it. Okay, as you can see, we run our job. It works fine. And you can see we have handling all. It means that invocation was triggered right after the executing step, book reader step, and we read the books from the data from our endpoint and put them to the database. And as you remember, for example, we had in this import SQL we had titles and authors in this view. Okay, and if you trigger this, reload this book, you can see that we have processed title to the uppercase and added by. It means that our batch job works as we expected. Okay, and next one, what I want you to show is how we can configure, for example, to invoke our batch job not on startup of application, but for some, for example, at some time, at some periodic of time. First of all, you need to disable Sprint batch job execution on startup. For these purposes, you need to, in the application properties, you need to add configuration Sprint batch job enable false. After you added it, Sprint won't execute any batch job you have. So as you can see, no jobs are triggered. So as you can see, my data is not processed. Okay, and after that, you can manually trigger your job. And let me create configuration for the scheduler. You can use a scheduler just to create some schedule to execute your job. First of all, let me add configuration, and let's add enable scheduling to enable scheduling. Okay, and let's add AutoWire our job launcher from the Sprint batch. Let me make it as private. And let's AutoWire job. And we need a method to be executed periodically. So let me add scheduler. And you can set up your scheduler any way you want. We have some video on very old, but still actual video on our channel regarding the Sprint scheduler. You can check on the internet, or you can check our video how to configure scheduler, for example. But I just show you with fixed delay scheduler. Let's say we want to set up 10,000 milliseconds, and let's say initial delay as 2000 milliseconds, which means 2 seconds. Okay, and let's call it schedule job. And to see in logs when our schedule work, let's add logs. Schedule job, and let's add another one. And what we can do, we can say job launcher run, and we can pass our job, and we can pass new job parameters, and that's it. Let me throw just exception. Okay, and let's run our application and check if it works fine. And as you can see, our application waited a couple of seconds and our batch job works. But if you check logs further, you will see that step already complete or not restartable. So action to execute step won't be done. It means that this Sprint can't understand that step was already executed, and it won't execute a further step. So what can we do? We can distinguish our job. We can, for example, add some milliseconds system time to distinguish our job, and we can trigger this will help Sprint to trigger job every time. Okay, and let me, let me create a new job parameter. Let me call job parameters builder and add long, and I'm gonna add uniqueness and system nanotime, and this will help us to avoid this warning when Spring doesn't want to execute job because it's already completed or not restartable. Okay, and since we will read from the REST returns us data already with ID, so our database won't be populated with data. In the batch config, let's uncomment our previous reader and comment this REST book reader, and let's trigger our batch job. Okay, as you can see, we executed first one, inserted data, and let's wait for the next job. As you can see, it's finished, okay, and we're waiting some time, and scheduler started to work once again, and it will work until I stop my application. Of course, you can schedule your application to execute some job with some periodic, some period, for example, once a day or once a week. It depends on your requirements. So, of course, oh, sorry, I stopped application. Let me rerun it. Okay, I just wanted to show you that we store in the database data. Okay, so as you can see, we have data. Okay, already 12, and once another job will execute, it will add more records to the database. As you can see, 21 already, and one as I trigger. No, not yet. Yeah, this one, and it will work continually. And another way to set up the job in Sprint Batch is not using chunk step, but using Tasklet. And let me show you also this example. Okay, let's create first of all our Tasklet job. And to make our job as Tasklet, we need to implement Tasklet. And we need to implement execute. In the chunk, we had reader, processor, and writer. In the Tasklet, we have just execute, and it will repeat this job until a repeated status is finished, or until some exception is thrown, or until null is returned. So this job will be executed continually. And you can put in this Tasklet any job you want. For example, you want to. In this example, I just show you some logs execution, but you can also read books from some file. You can read some data from file, write it, process it, etc. Okay, and let me, you know what, add log executing Tasklet. And as I told you, if we return now, this job will be executed only once. Let me navigate to my batch configuration, okay, and configure this Tasklet job. We need to create another step. And let's call it Tasklet step. We also need job repository and platform transaction manager. And this time we're gonna return new step builder. If you remember, we return new step builder and chunk, and we return reader, processor, and writer. But this one, we're gonna return new step builder, Tasklet, new book Tasklet, and transaction manager, and build. And of course, we need to set up our name to our builder and job repository. And we can put this Tasklet step to the to our job in start, for example. And our job not only has start, it has next. We can set up steps. For example, we can execute chunk step as first step, and we can execute Tasklet step as next step, or we can configure another chunk step to be executed for this job. So you can set up next, and you can set up as much next as you need. Let me create Tasklet step and job repository transaction manager. Yeah. And of course you can set up next, and you can put jobs to your job. You can put steps to your steps. So you have start step, and you can set up any next step you want. Of course, we could substitute this chunk step. Let me write this application, run this application, and check. So we have our step. Let me stop it, and let's check our logs. As you can see, we have started our job, and we have step book reader step, writing books, and as you can see, we executed Tasklet step after we executed book reader step, and we see our execution Tasklet only once. As I told you, we have only one execution of this Tasklet because we return null. But what if we want to return continue? If we return repeated status continuable, our Tasklet step will be executed periodically without stopping. Let me remove this chunk step and put this Tasklet step. I want to show you just one step example. Okay, and let me show you how we will return. Always will execute this Tasklet step continually. As you can see, execution Tasklet, and it won't stop until I stop the application. Okay, knowing this, you can configure your Tasklet, your execute method to return sometimes continually, sometimes null, sometimes exceptions. For example, what you can do, you can create, for example, int something like that, and you can say that if counter equals, for example, 5, you're gonna return finish. Otherwise, you will return continually. Of course, you need to increase counter. And else something like that. Okay, and if you return finished, you need to set up counter to 0 because you executing this job periodically using scheduler. So you need to set this counter to 0 once you reached your maximum. Okay, and if you run this application, you can see that you execute Tasklet 6 times. Okay, and after that, as you can see, you again execute it, and it will be executed until I stop my application, and because my scheduler starts my job. But as you can see, we execute this Tasklet only 6 times, because 6 is the execution Tasklet. This one, for example, if I put it in the end of this method, it will be 5 times. But it doesn't matter for us. I think you got the point that we can use Sprint Batch, and we can configure it in different ways. We can use chunk step, we can use Tasklet, and we can configure as many jobs as we want, and we can configure as many steps as we want in one job. We can configure many processor for one step. And yeah, that's it for now. I hope you liked it, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel, and I see you soon. Goodbye.